So hello everybody, and welcome to our symposium for today. As this is the end of the year and it's currently the festive season in Europe, and that's where we're coming from today. So we have Daniel, remind me exactly where you are in the world. Are you in Zurich?
I'm in Zurich, yeah, in
Uh,
Switzerland.
so, so we have myself coming to you from Churchill College in Cambridge today. We have Professor Chris Rowley coming from Oxford, and we have Daniel from Zurich. And the whole point of this session today, it's more of a kind of a little bit of a relaxed session, if you like, basically bringing two very distinguished guests in to speak about books that have influenced them in terms of maybe their leadership or in terms of their strategy. So the distinguished guests are, as you're probably aware, Professor Chris Rowley. A little bit about his background. Chris is a fellow of Kellogg College, and he's, as I've said to you before, he's probably one of the most prolific authors that I know. He publishes frequently in journals, book chapters, etc., and is also responsible for editing a number of business journals. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
And our second distinguished guest is Daniel Helmig. So Daniel has a DBA from UBIS. He, in the past, has led numerous companies, including at the senior executive level, I might add, including PepsiCo, Ford, Union Bank of Switzerland, to name a few. And Daniel is coming from Zurich today. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start off with Chris, and I've asked our distinguished panelists to identify three books in particular, as I mentioned, which has influenced their maybe their thinking, their leadership skills, their thoughts on strategy. And what I will do is I will alternate from each guest to each guest. And I'd like you to give us a little bit of a rationale also about why these books were so influential for you. So let's start with Professor Chris Rowley. Chris, what's your first choice?
Thanks very much. Stuart, thank you for the warm welcome. Greetings to everybody in the symposium today. And as you can see, it's a sunny day in Oxford for once. It's never so sunny in Cambridge. So I've got three books today that deeply influenced me. I mean, my quick background is I left school when I was 16 and worked. That's why I'm interested in work as a broad topic. Till I went to university as a so-called mature student, which I just think means an old student. I wasn't particularly mature when I was there. I was like a normal student. The first I pick is by a famous author called Alan Fox. And Alan, he's obviously no longer with us. Alan actually served during the Second World War he flew mosquitoes over Germany, but he didn't fly them. He was a photographer in the bottom bit taking photographs of Germany during the war. And after the war, he came to Oxford and he went to Nuffield College, actually. So that's how I know him. I only knew him when he retired. And he did a famous set of pieces of work, really. And you need to sort of transport yourself back to Britain in the 1960s, which was the sick man of Europe. There were strikes everywhere. And they commissioned a Royal Commission called A Place of Strife. They were thinking, how can we replace strife with something? Barbara Castle was then the Secretary of State. And they commissioned a set of research papers, all of which came from Oxford, of course. They didn't come from Cambridge. They came from the Oxford School of Industrial Relations, of which Alan Fox was a research member. And he produced a famous piece of work trying to explain the reasons behind conflict, industrial conflict in particular. And this has stuck with me ever since. And he called it a perspective. We have a perspective on business and management. And he called one perspective a unitary perspective. And in this, he said, people think very much alike and that businesses are unitary. By that, they mean this sort of whole. And we all have got a common purpose and we all believe in the same things and we all want to go the same way. That's a very interesting view. Management tended to take a unitary perspective. However, he also then had the other side of the coin and produced something what he called a pluralist perspective. And by pluralism, he meant more than one. So it's plural. And a pluralist perspective on industrial relations or work was that we actually had different views of work. And yes, the company and business is important. It provides us with security and pensions and structure and motivation. However, there are other things that we're drawn to, whether that's trade union or family or work or whatever. We didn't necessarily only think the one way. And so he flagged up these two sort of diagrammatically opposed views of why the same event is looked at differently, whether that's pay or working conditions or innovation or redundancies, doesn't really matter. There will always be this dichotomy. There's a third Marxist version that I won't get into because, as ever with academics, they disappear in a circle. It's best to start with these basic principles. And so Alan produced this piece of work for a famous document in the famous Royal Commission. It also went, it probably doesn't work out, they did make it into a book called Man Mismanagement. He didn't call it man management, he called it man mismanagement. And so that's why this book influenced me when I went there as a student. He retired. He worked in the Oxfam book shop. So I used to meet him in there. That's where I got this book from, signed by him. I used to go to the Oxfam bookshop in Oxford and chat to him about things. He was in his late 70s, early 80s then. And those ideas are still relevant today. And I often think that managers sometimes don't understand that there's more than one perspective on work and life and management. It's not just all unitary, it's also pluralist. So hopefully I haven't taken up too much of my allocated time, given there's 9 books to get through.
No, thanks very much, Chris. That's fascinating. And again, the fact that you feel that the book has relevance today. Sometimes we look at these books and they become dated very quickly, but that's really fascinating. Thanks.
A quick aside: I still quote him today. If you look at my articles, you'll often see a reference to Fox 1974.
Right.
Or the FT. I've done a couple of letters in the FT where again he goes in there.
Yeah. Good.
So yeah, he's still relevant.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, Daniel, how about you?
Okay. And I think as well that there are a lot of books that actually hold true, even if they are a little bit older, because there are some, we're not that special and different over the decades, I think. So when I looked at the 3 books, we had a chance to communicate before, and I thought that I looked at more things coming more from the trenches, but I mean, Professor Rowley had as well worked before, but I did it as well then for 40 years. So I look more on topics that are relevant during my time, and some of them are less academic, but had this immense impact on my survival and evolution, I would say. So if you are curious about the other books that shaped me, some of you know, I run a podcast called the Supply Chain Dialogues that you can have, and there in season 2, episode 15 and 16, there are 20 books that I thought are very relevant. So we today are just doing 3 that are the main core. So the first one, and here I can do even older, is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Yeah. Now this is ancient. It's talking 5th century BCE. Chinese military strategist, and yes, I know everyone else references Sun Tzu. It becomes a bit of a cliche in business books, right? But here's the thing. I read this book cover to cover every year since my days as an automotive negotiator in the global supply chain at Ford Motor Company, every single year. And each time I read it, I find something new. You could as well argue, well, maybe you just don't understand it, and that's the reason why you read it all the time. But it helped me. So what is Sun Tzu's central idea? It's supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. In other words, the best negotiation is the one where the other party doesn't realize that it's been negotiated with and complies with your requirements. That was being most of the time in procurement, later in operations, and even negotiating internally with customers was quite important for me to figure out and get a hang out of that. So when I was transforming ABB's whole organization from a hybrid central-led to a fully decentral organization, Sun Tzu plus another academic study from Harvard and St. Gallen over 600 companies became my guiding stars. And here's what nobody tells you. The internal negotiations that you have and that I had in the company, but probably you as well, can be as complex or even complexer than the external ones. And getting functional heads to surrender their cozy relationships, that requires talking about knowing the enemy and knowing thyself. I had to understand their fears, their incentives, and their political positions, then position my proposal so that they appear to serve their interest while achieving my transformation objectives. It went actually quite smooth, kind of a semi-judo style way of thinking. And when you look at Zinsur and you talk about culture in a cultural environment of a company, there are different ways of how that can be said. Zinsur would say culture is the terrain in which you have to understand your position and have your forces correctly set up. And then you don't fight culture head on. You flow around it like water, around obstacles, finding the path of the least resistance while still reaching the objective. So from that perspective, Zinsur, timeless wisdom for me on the battlefield of corporate was actually the first book that I wanted to talk about, and it really helped me.
That's really fascinating, Daniel, because, it is the book that everybody references. I mean, there's probably two. One is Blue Ocean Strategy, and the other one is this. But the fact that I think what is quite powerful is the fact that you not only read it, but read it multiple times and was able then to leverage on the outcome of that to actually employ it in a strategy that was implemented within an organization as well. So that's really quite fascinating. I mean, on this topic, what I sense from both Chris and Daniel is that these books have come along that have kind of left an indelible impression on you both. And it kind of takes me back to my time. I'd come out of academia and gone into a startup, an edu startup in London, which was just a very, very it was very dispiriting because on the one hand, I saw my salary double, so my rewards increased, but the pressures also increased, and the organization was really dysfunctional. I mean, grossly dysfunctional, and I don't think I had the necessary skill sets to actually write that organization. So it was when I entered it, and I had to learn on the job, and I use the word dispiriting because it was very, very demoralizing, because I was essentially fighting with the guy that owned the company to try and help him not destroy his own company. So as you can imagine, it was a challenge. And one of the book that really influenced me, following on with this thing was Ben Horowitz. I'm not sure if you've come across his book, but the book's called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And really the key takeaway from that book was it doesn't really matter. It's all about resilience, and it's about the resilience of the entrepreneur, because I was able to reference that book in a sense that if I was having a bad day, then his bad days were 3 times worse than anything I'd experienced, and he was still able to survive. Interesting. So fascinating. Okay, Chris, I'm going to move over to you and ask you what's your second choice today.
Thanks, John. Interesting insight in about perspective, isn't it? A bit like you, sometimes I wake up and thinking, no, this is grim. Then I think, actually, I could be a president of a college. That is really grim. Or as it's often put to me, trying to lead an Oxford college is like going up a downward escalator under gunfire. So, at least it's not like that. Mine's just dealing with people complaining about my judgment on an editorial journal article in respect trivial. So thank you for that. I just want to quick slide back to the first book, because I actually do use one quote from Sun Tzu when I teach a class on leadership, and I always use the same person in leadership in terms of Shackleton, famous explorer who got his men home, and one of the strategies he used was exactly from that, where he kept his friends close, but he kept his enemies even closer. And that's exactly what Shackleton did when he tried to get his 26 crew members back home. He put all his skeptic crew members in his tent. And so that must have been a lovely evening to have with all these people saying, we're doomed, we're going to die. He didn't want those people polluting, the other crew members. So yeah, I do quote him. My second book really it builds on that in that I was fascinated with the world of work. And when I did completed my DPhil, it was very UK focused. It was even more than UK focused. It was based on Stoke-on-Trent. It's all about the ceramics industry because that's where I was born and grew up, and my first jobs. And the first place I went to work in was Cardiff Business School, and they were fascinated by Japan. The Japanization of British industry had started to happen in the 1980s and 90s, and investment poured into South Wales because it had good golf courses and good schools and all sorts of reasons. Big grants, of course. And so I was fascinated in the difference. And so the second book was a famous book by Ron Dahl, who was at the LSE. And Ron Dahl was, again, a fascinating character in that he'd gone and lived in Japan. He was an anthropologist. And he lived in Japan and did all sorts of things. And then he got interested in work. And he did a famous book called British Factory, Japanese Factory, where he produced a fascinating account of two factories making the same product in two different countries. This is really just before Japan became Japan number one, to quote the famous book of Ezra Vogel from Harvard in 1979. People were vaguely interested in Japan, but he was ahead of the curve. And so if you read that, it's fascinating in a completely different way work is structured. Go back to the idea about me with a pluralist and a individualist perspective. Japan was different again, and much more of a collectivist perspective, much more about responsibility, your manager's responsibility for you. And of course, that required commitment back. It's a two-way street, this, So that's what drove my interest into sort of Asia and Japan and Korea and China. But it started with British factory, Japanese factory. And again, Ron passed away about 5 years ago. And I went to a seminar in his honor at St. Anthony's. And these people came from all over the world. Unbelievable. I thought it was just a peculiar person from the LSE. But oh no, people came from Japan. He was honored in Japan as one of the original thinkers that thought about Japanese industry, Japanese culture. And so he's probably highly regarded in Japan than he is here, which is unheard of. So that's my second book. It was the British Factory, Japanese Factory from Ron Dahl.
Yeah, fascinating. As someone who's lived in Japan, I lived in Japan for 3 years, as you know, and worked at Fujifilm. And it was interesting. I've just gone through a house move, and so basically I was unpacking all my my books and found the stash of books that I'd accumulated on Japanese politics, Japanese business. So it's really, really a fascinating experience. And I cast my mind back when I went to Fujifilm the first time. I was shown around their awards. And I don't know if you guys ever remember Malcolm Deming, the Deming Awards.
Yeah.
So this was an award that I, as a wet behind the ears, fresh graduate, I'd never heard of this guy. And yet these guys were like, the Fujifilm had got 3 of these Deming Awards, and it's on quality. And they were just so proud of this kind of thing. And it's kind of ironic then, 30 or 40, 50 years later, we're beginning to import, or we started to import. And Daniel, I'm sure you were at the forefront of this, importing things like lean production, like the Toyota production system and all that kind of thing. So it's ironic how the Japanese were learning from us. And then, 20, 30 years later, we're learning from them. Fantastic. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Daniel, how about you? Second choice, please.
Yeah, just one thing you mentioned Deming. So therefore, I need to tell you, I mean, my most favorite quote that I use wherever it fits or does not fit is always, survival is optional. And that is absolutely true when you look at how the companies basically went into Lean or Lean Six Sigma, and we implemented Lean Six Sigma in several companies. And you could see those that didn't do it, they were a couple of years later, they were gone.
Yeah,
Same
that's right.
thing as we are going to see most probably with everything that is happening right now with AI. You can just say, I don't like AI or whatever. Industrial revolution, you don't do it, bye-bye. So survival is optional. That's at least my stake on that. But let's go to a book.
Huh?
Alternatively, so it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I'll tell you why I nevertheless choose it in this very nice setting. My second book is Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. It was published in 1998. Now, it's a simple parable, but a powerful one. And let me tell you why I choose it, because it both influenced my own life, but as well when I left Ford Motor Company after 20 years. This book was my parting gift to my management team at that point in time. And guess what? 1 year later, 50% of them, like me, had left, citing later on that
Interesting.
this book opened their eyes.
Wow.
Uh, it's about four characters, two mice called Sniff and Scurry, and two little people called Ham and Haw. They live in a maze searching for cheese every day. When the cheese disappears, the mice immediately adapt and search for new cheese. And the little people, they resist, feel victimized, and reduce and refuse to accept the reality. And critics of the book say it's simplistic. They say it justifies corporate callousness, treating people as disposable. And you know what? It's a fair point, but here's what it did for me personally. This book saved my career, possibly my life. After 20 years with Ford, I was the classic lifer on track of a comfortable mediocrity. I got an egomaniacal person with a Napoleon complex who became my boss, the new head of procurement in Europe. And we had a history. I crossed him multiple times and before his promotion, and he did not like me. So when I, at that point in time, read the book, I moved my Who Moved My Cheese, it made me realize my cheese has been moved. And I could either be ham, sitting in an empty cheese station complaining, or haw, and getting off my arse, sorry for the French, and finding new cheese. So I left Ford, and that was the best decision I ever made. What I learned from that painful moment was that develop antennas to when your cheese is moving before it disappears completely. Over the next 20 years, ABB, Infineon, Credit Suisse, PepsiCo, I watched for signals, reorganization rumors, new boss appointments, strategy shifts, and sometimes I even created the conditions myself that led to moving the cheese. And then I made sure that I was, if possible, handsomely rewarded for eliminating my own job. Each time I sensed my cheese moving, I didn't wait to become ham. I found better cheese before the old stuff disappeared. Now, the book is simplistic, I grant you that, but it as well taught me something valuable. Adaptability is a professional survival skill. Don't anchor your identity to a role, company, or situation. Anchor it on your capabilities and values, and then deploy it whenever the cheese is gone or there. So that's my personal master challenge regarding corporate culture. Let's move Who Moved My Cheese.
But that must have been, I mean, it's fascinating, Daniel, because as you say, you're 20 years in the one company, and that must have been a real challenge because having known that organization and then decide to leave it,
It
how,
was terrible. It
yeah,
was terrible. I mean, and everybody thought that I'm completely nuts
yeah,
to leave because at that point in time, I mean, there was still the time when you went into a large corporation, you stayed, if possible, as long as possible. This
yeah,
has changed in the meantime. I think
sure.
the new generation see it differently, but for me, it was as well scary like hell. But and even shortly before I left, I got a global job, so I would have moved to the US, and everything would be,
Mhm.
but still, it would have been incremental improvement, and I would have stayed in this environment. And just moving from there to something completely different, from cars to semiconductors, um, was enriching, beside the fact that I as well earned more, much more.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think in hindsight, as you say, it was a very valuable decision because it really enhanced your career and I think taught you some pretty strategic skills and how to kind of navigate through the global corporate world. So, very fascinating. Good, Chris. The last one of your three.
The last one of my three was building on where we've been with the first two, I was interested in work perspectives on work, and I became interested in Japan because of the place I got my first academic job in was fascinating about Japanese management practices, and that carried on. Then the people there, or one of the people there, Dan Jones was one of the authors, but Womack, as the lead author, produced a famous book called The Machine That Changed the World.
Mm.
And The Machine That Changed the World isn't going to be my book. This is the background of the book I'm going to choose. It was all about Toyota and Toyotaism. And I still use this on a slide because I always say, read the subtitle of the book. The subtitle of the book is What Industries Everywhere Can Learn. The Machine That Changed the World. If only you got the ingredients of Japanization, you would succeed. And I never believed that. Academically, you can fall out with people, and I feel like people about this because I said, "Oh no, if we become like Japan, the Japanization of British industry, Rover, British Leyland would be just like Toyota." I say, really? Other things are more important, aren't they? Oh, like what? Well, institutions is one, but the big one is culture. And so that's my third book. It's going to be called Cultured Consequences by a world famous, again, anthropologist called Gert Hofstede. The subtitle gives it away. It says, comparing values, behaviors, institutions across nations. And culture's not a new thing. You can go back to Weber, you can go back to all sorts of people writing in the 19th century. But what Hofstede did is he analyzed it. He gave you categories, 6. And he gave you dimensions, and he gave you measures. He allowed you to measure. That's what he did. He went off and he measured cultures and give them a number. High, medium, and low. And lo and behold, these numbers vary around the world on these 6 criteria. And when you apply it to, you end up with one dimension. The Japanese will score something like 92 out of 100. As Stuart will know, you make an appointment and a meeting, that is it, set in stone. Nothing's going to change it. You will be there. Nothing will change it. Look, the Chinese score on it, and it's something like 30 on uncertainty avoidance, which means they accept it. They don't care. They don't mind. Change a meeting. My email's full of emails every day from China changing things and dates. Don't get any from Japan that does that. And you can do that with collectivism, masculinity. There's all sorts of dimensions. So I think Hofstede, again, passed away 3 or 4 years ago. Prickly individual, and there were other people that were doing similar things. I understand that, Pompadour and Hampton Turner, culture. But I always pick his because he was at the forefront of doing it. He worked for IBM and all sorts of companies. And he allows us an analytical tool that I still use today. Again, I use him when I do things for the FT, trying to explain how come the electric vehicle industry wasn't developed so quickly in Germany and Japan as it was in China and America to a certain extent, but certainly China. How come that was the case? Culture tells us why. Uncertainty avoidance is a reason behind it. The Chinese have very low scores on that. They don't mind the uncertainty. The Japanese and the Germans have high scores. They don't like it on the whole. So that's my third choice. It sort of builds on the work comparisons. How can we explain those? Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, fascinating, and it's something that I tended to use as well. His 6 dimensions of culture. I think that was something that was very, very useful, and it was interesting from the perspective of, as you know, some of the team that work for me are from Malaysia, and the 6 dimensions of culture will allow you to map, these 6 attributes based on your nationality against their nationality, and the first one is power distance. I think my memory serves me correctly. And when I put that, the Malaysian stroke the UK, the whole kind of deferential thing was very, very strong there, which was kind of interesting. And what, from my own kind of management style, what that meant is I recognized that I'd fallen into a habit of simply dictating the outcome. So that we're going to do this. And I didn't actually ask them what they thought, whether this was a really good idea or it was a really dumb idea. And so, having that helped me to step back and evaluate my leadership relationship with
Yeah.
my Malaysian team and try and ensure that they were more engaged from giving their own, from a value input, if you like, giving their own ideas and their own thoughts, and occasionally and very importantly, telling me that I was wrong and saying that no, this is not a good idea, which was refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, I used it. One of the first things I did was some research for Samsung in Malaysia, actually,
Yeah.
in Kuala Lumpur. They couldn't quite work out how come their factory in Kuala Lumpur was less efficient in terms of output than their factories in Suwon, Seoul.
Uh,
And it didn't take you long to work out why, because they transported all their senior managers there into this factory in Korea. But of course, the workforce isn't Korean; it's multi-ethnic. It's got
Sounds, of
Buniputra,
course.
obviously, and it's also got Nepalese, Pakistanis, you name it. They were in there. This was a multinational work, and the Koreans didn't understand that. They
mm,
thought it was a Korean workforce. The Korean values about deference and hierarchy and collectivism and all the other dimensions culture is measured on. And the classic one was in the mornings when they played the company song like all Koreans do. Samsung being the best in the world and be number one. It was in Korean. And the workforce would stand there looking up at the video screen with no clue or what was going on because they don't speak Korean. Why would they? And it's this song going in Korean. And the second dimension was the factory canteen where they had two lines. One was for Korean food and one's for non-Korean food. And the third one was Friday afternoons. How come on a Friday afternoon the Korean factory stopped? And it took them a while to work this one out because the Koreans were there. I used to go on a Friday afternoon. The Korean managers would be there, the officers would be there, the jackets would be on the back of the chair. But there'd be no workforce. They're all down the mosque.
mm. Spare
And they
time.
didn't quite understand it was no longer Seoul. This was a very different place. So there you go. That's a war story for you.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Daniel, how about your third book?
I give this topic a little bit more airtime, if you allow me,
Yes, please go ahead.
because I think this is for all people now here on the panel who are sitting and listening to us. If there is something that we older dudes can as well share with you, it is you need to understand the culture of the people you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And whether you like it or not, it's very different from your own culture if you deal internationally. And it's not only the apparent things, but as well the headset which is behind that. Hofstetter, I loved, I think was great. There is another book which is a little bit more, I would say, semi academic, which is from Aaron Meyer,
Yeah.
The Culture Map, which I used as well a lot. It helped me quite significantly in terms of understanding. It lacks, if we look at here as well, the audience, it lacks, for example, the focus on the African side of the culture. There was, at that point in time when she read the book, there was not too much African leadership and management in there. But still, it is good if you're dealing a lot with Europeans or with Westerners and Asians. It's quite helpful. And similar story like the Korean ones, and then I get quickly to my book. Volvo was acquired at some point in time by Ford. Before that, they were trying to be acquired, or a French company was trying to acquire them. Now, the French took the company more or less over. Volvo is in Sweden, and then the French came in there, and the whole management team on the day of the integration came on board. They put the map of Europe up there, and it showed France, it showed Germany, but it did not show Scandinavia because they did not need it in the past. And you can imagine how well the Swedes liked it, and the French were quicker out than they could say "Vive la France." And so, with that, let me get to the third book. But culture is just so important.
Yeah. If I can take
Sure.
an add to that as well, Daniel, there's a very interesting story when I was at the University of Kent, I had two guys in from AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company, and you know the story behind this was Zeneca was again a Swedish company established. Astra was this young scrappy company from the UK, and was able to raise sufficient revenue to essentially do. I'm not going to suggest it was a hostile takeover, but it wasn't particularly well received by the workforce at Zeneca, who are these guys from Astra. And one of the things that the two guys from Astra, they were making me laugh because they said that in the factory in Sweden, they placed a new sign on the ground, and it was literally at knee height, which read AstraZeneca. And in the winter time, the guys from Zeneca would walk past it and kick snow on the front of the side. So it completely obscured the Astra and just left the word Zeneca. So having the ability, as you say, to convince the workforce that this merger or this acquisition is actually a good idea is important.
Oh,
Daniel,
that's
over to you.
cute. That's good. Okay, so getting to the third book, and as well, based on the fact that this was started around the topic of as well the Financial Times book list. And what I learned here at UBS and what you learn during the academic studies as well is your that you keep on and keep your head on in terms of critical thinking. So my last book is something which is well very personal for me, but it is well something which I can relate to then the FT list. So the third book is called The Man Who Broke Capitalism. And it's by David Gallis. That's the newest book from the ones that I'm quoting. That's from published in 2022. And this one hurts for me a bit. David Gallis is a well-known journalist for the New York Times. The subtitle tells you everything about the book, how Jack Welch gutted the heartland and crushed the soul of corporate America, and how to undo his legacy. Now, here's my confession. I was a huge Jack Welch disciple. Yeah, this was the CEO of GE and set up this whole topic for the first time that was academically at that point in time coming from America as well in terms of the shareholder capitalism, shareholder value focus. I read his books, listened to his talks. I implemented his methods. That was one of the his books were the most well-read books that I had besides Zinse. When I was transforming organization, cutting costs, and that's what I did a lot, consolidating operations and driving efficiency, I channeled my inner Welsh. Yeah, so Newton Jack would have been proud of me. And then David Gallis published this book recently, and I had to confront. For my whole life, I was really thinking this was my hero, and there was an uncomfortable truth. Much of what I learned and practiced was fundamentally wrong, not just slightly off, wrong. Gels documents how Welch's 20 years tenure at GE from 81 to 2001 destroyed stakeholder capitalism with shareholder value maximization, quarterly earning obsessions, forced rankings, which still are existing, unfortunately, today. They're terrible, as well once linked to that, which is this rank or yank. Yeah? When you're in the bottom 10%, you're out. Mass layoffs and financialization and personal enrichment. What appeared a brilliant leadership, GE's soaring stock price and Welch's celebrity CEO status was actually hollowing out Americans' industrial capacity. Devastating communities, the whole Midland. Yeah, that's the reason why Trump is so successful, because these guys were all losing their jobs, and ladies, enriching executives while impoverishing workers. It was capitalistic vampirism, sucking what's good and decent of a company and leaving long term an empty shell. Look at GE today and you see what I mean. And here's the kicker. Welch philosophy metastasized into corporate America. 16 public companies, including Boeing, with twice of his disciples, Home Depot, Chrysler, later Fiat, ended up being run who have started at his knees. And look at Boeing and the issues that they have today. This is related to this strategy, all with mediocre to disastrous results. But as Goldman Sachs board member said once, they were just cost cutters. And you can't cost cut your way into prosperity, which everyone knows. Now, there's what's relevant to today's discussion as well with regard to the FT Business Books shortlist that was just named, the one that was the best there. Most of these books assume American style capitalism is the benchmark. Klein and Thompson's Abundance wants to make America's capitalism work better through deregulation. Fishman's Choke Points celebrates America's economic dominance. Even Nvidia's book iconicized American tech entrepreneurship, although I would argue that this actually is more related to TSMC than it was to Nvidia, but that's just my take. For each of the books of this list, I can name you two or more that fundamentally take different stances. So when you read Gillis and you read these business books today, you always ask yourself, work better for whom when the solution comes. And when you read a clearly Anglo-Americanized kind of culture as well with the business books, you get the impression that these guys know where the result lies. I wouldn't see it that way necessarily. And I believe stronger in the European stakeholder capitalism that we, for example, have in Germany or in France or whatever. Uh, it's not just about quarterly shareholder returns. The uncomfortable truth for me was I spent 40 years in a system that Welch and his cronies broke, learning methods that Welch corrupted. Now I'm trying to help the next generation to avoid those mistakes. And that's where a little bit of my focus is in terms of now teaching and lecturing and this kind of stuff, because I learned it the hard way. So stay critical with all these disciples and all these gurus that tell you that's the way to go for it. That's my third book.
Absolutely, and fascinating observation. And I think, I can really sense the fact that you've employed his methods and then kind of reflect upon them and have become quite skeptical of them in many instances. And I think your reference to the hollowing out of the heartland is interesting because, and I'm sure Chris will agree, we've had similar experiences in the United Kingdom. And if you look at the Roundtree reports on the kind of the way in which the working classes in the UK, the rationale for them voting for Brexit, it was more to do with, I think, an anti-globalization message, because these were left behind communities that never recovered from the mining communities, these steel communities, and they never got back. It's just interesting.
I'll just pick you up on that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Perfectly right about the hollowing out of the homeland, or where you want to call it. Does happen in the UK. And an explanatory variable for Brexit would be, I always use a comparison between Oxford and Stoke. Oxford, 70% voted to remain, 32% voted to leave. The national average is 52-48. Stoke-on-Trent, 70% leave, 30% remain. Completely reversed.
No wonder.
Completely reversed. That's why I always use the two. Well, I was born in Stoke and my family is still there, obviously. That's why I use the two as an example, saying, well, this is not 52-48 here. These are clear 70-30s one way, but 70-30 the other way.
Yeah. And just for clarity for those people on the call that may not know, Stoke-on-Trent was a very big ceramics manufacturing city, and it's famous for its ceramics, but very much, Chris, post-industrial, right?
Yeah,
and then
the biggest employer in Stoke-on-Trent now is a company called Bet365, online betting company.
Yeah.
There's no manufacturing there anymore.
Here you have Oxford, where you have 70% voting to stay, and we all know Oxford, but Stoke-on-Trent, post-industrial, and maybe highly regional depression, etc. In that area. So and it's one of these left behind communities like the steel mills, the steel production in Wales, etc. And Daniel, and one of the kind of fascinating things I heard recently in Germany was these towns that were built around BASF, etc. And now these factories are closing, and are we seeing that same kind of situation in Germany as well, like a hollowing out?
Yes, we do see it, and it will happen, but the root causes are differently. Here you have a completely failed industrial government policy. And which resulted, for example, extremely high energy prices. We have the highest energy prices in the world.
Yeah,
Can you
that's
imagine
right.
in Germany? In the world. And what you then have, and I worked in procurement and operations most of my life. So which industries require the most energy? It's the process industries.
That's
And
right.
that's chemicals, that's pharmaceutical, that's steel, that's cement. And guess where the companies are moving and investing somewhere else? They don't have a chance. They are in industrial, they are in international competition. They have to go. Now, the rest of the companies, the automotive companies, and all the other companies that is well going now nosediving, that's a different story. It's it's about basically a cultural arrogance towards India, China, and any other area there, where they were saying they will never be as good as us. And that is absolutely crazy because the boards did the same mistake. I mentioned that as well in my last talk. Every 10 years, yeah, in the time when the Japanese basically come with their cars, for example, and their
Yeah,
products, they say they
that's
will
right.
never be able to do that. Boom, they were done. Then the Koreans came, and I was sitting in board meetings where they're saying Koreans will never do it. Boom, they are there. Then it's the Chinese, but saying, oh, it's always the cheap cars. And that's complete BS. I mean, right now, the whole Europe is trying to get as much as possible EV cars, but not Chinese EV cars because there we need tariffs. So, no, it's a different background, but it will lead to a deindustrialization, I think, of Germany if not something is seriously changing, which I don't see.
Fantastic, interesting. And I really like to kind of maybe just wind things up a little bit. But before we do, I'd like just to share my thoughts on the session today, which has been fascinating, by the way. So thank you for your time, both Daniel and Chris. I was fortunate to go to China for the first time in 2002. So I'd been in Japan, and of course, Japan went into decline after the bubble economy burst in the late 1980s. Um, and so and maybe Daniel, I think you had this experience in China as well. So I went through that Wild East time in China, where basically it was the Chinese were extracting themselves from the traditional command economy. You were getting these special economic zones had grown up, and finally they were beginning to fully open. You know, with they joined the WTO in 2001, and that period, that experience, and thinking about culture, we talked about culture today. We talked about negotiations, Daniel, and somewhat ironically, having that experience of negotiating with Chinese partners in those days was really kind of enlightening because the negotiations by Western standards were completely irrational. Contracts had been signed, and even though the contracts had been signed, we were negotiating still on pricing and things like that. And I was flabbergasted in the sense that they said, "Oh, we want to talk to you about your pricing." I said, "No, we've agreed the pricing. It's in the contract, the one that you signed," which was largely irrelevant. And to watch my Chinese clients go from being really difficult in terms of negotiations on price and then becoming increasingly more comfortable. Yeah, that's fine. We have money now. Well, to be honest, this is not big money for us. I mean, and now kind of going back, the wheel is kind of turning a little bit because the Chinese economy is not performing as well as I believe that they wish. And therefore, the price sensitivity is creeping into the negotiations again, which is interesting. But there's one book for me that really articulates this whole time very well. It's a book by a guy called Desmond Shue. It's called Red Roulette. And I know, Daniel, you referenced the book on Apple and China. That's an interesting one. I've just started that. But the Shue book is fascinating because it starts with him and his wife getting into business. And the wife in particular gets very close to the government. So she's able to secure contracts for them because of the connections. This concept of it would be guanxi, as they say in China. No guanxi, no business. So she has very, very strong ties with the government, resulting in the fact that they get contracts that they maybe don't have the skill sets to develop, but they complete them. It's very much in construction, construction of airports, construction of other areas as well. But it really, as I mentioned, articulates this time in China really, really well. And it ends quite sadly in the sense that she disappears. So he leaves China. He can't go back to China anymore. I mean, there was allegations of corruption, whether they were true remain to be seen. But she disappears, and it's a very interesting insight into that time. And thinking about the purpose of this talk, these are books that have left a lasting impression on us as academics or as business people, that have influenced our leadership styles, influenced the way in which we develop strategies, etc. This one had a big impact on me. Not because it made me a better or a worse leader, not because it influenced my thinking about strategy in relation to China, but it was more of a cautionary story, in the sense that you have to be very careful when you get into these kind of negotiations. You have to ensure that you have an exit strategy. And I've done business in Russia, and I've done so that was in which I've had a bank account closed down because I did business in Russia, which was before the conflict with Ukraine, I might add. But it's interesting that how things change. So I'd like just to open the floor a little bit to our guests on the call. Is there anybody who would like to maybe chat more about this with Chris or with Daniel, about their choices? Azhar.
First of all, thank you, gentlemen, for the books and the motivations that led you to the books, and it's really interesting to learn what shapes your thinking and shapes your direction. I think the main focus in a lot of the books is culture, business culture. I think this is just and basically I come from a background where I was brought up on poetry of Allama Iqbal, Muhammad Iqbal, who's a well-known poet who actually goes a long journey of investigating in the inner self. So that led me also brought up also through my childhood as an Islamic scholar, and also to be a mullah leading people in prayer at the time I was 16. But I decided to question that, and then I went to a book which is called Al-Biruni's India, which was done by a Muslim traveler, which looked at objective anthropology of Indian caste system and Indian religion, and it went into Sanskrit, etc. The question I wanted to ask you is, does your childhood have a reflection on the kind of books or the interest you show in books? Is that apparent in you, or is it something that you've evolved over your journey in life? So that's the question I wanted to ask. Did you hear that? Or
Yeah, we did. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to hear from Professor.
So maybe if I sense the question, is it kind of the familiarity with books? What kind of worries me a little bit about Donald Trump is he doesn't read, and that for me is slightly worrying, because there's so much information out there that I think, Daniel, you referenced the fact that when you referenced the Financial Times book list, it's really, really critical. I reference that all the time just because it helps to keep me relevant. So do you both, Chris and Daniel, did you come from a household where reading was encouraged, and did that influence your direction?
Do you want to go first, Daniel? Or do you want me to go? I'll go first.
Please, you go first.
Well, you already know I come from Stoke-on-Trent, so you burn books there. Then my father, in fact, I spoke to him this morning. He was a millwright by training, and obviously he's one of 10. He had five brothers himself and four sisters. My grandfather was a coal miner who worked permanent nights. So I've never quite worked out how the 10 children came, but we had 10. So no, my household was book free. No deliberately policy to be book free, just didn't have them. Mum worked at the local factory. Dad worked originally for British Aerospace, and eventually Michelin tire factories when they still made Michelin tires here. He worked for them all his life. I mean, cut a long story short, I came to reading books because as I said, I left school at 16 and worked, and I went back to education part-time. And all the jobs I was doing when I was working don't exist anymore, but I wasn't that clever to know they wouldn't exist due to deindustrialization. I looked at people my age, as I am now, thinking, I really don't fancy 40 years of this. So I went back to college part-time, a wonderful teacher there who introduced me to all sorts of reading about labour history. That's how it started. She was an historian. So I was sort of led into it, like with carrots, really. She said, "Oh, have you read this?" No, I haven't. Well, it's about this and it's about that. So I was led to the water, but by her. Again, she's no longer with us, but I think about her every week. Dedicated my DPhil to her. A wonderful woman. So it's by accident. If I had not met her on that night when I went to register, I wouldn't be here today. Call that serendipity if you wish. But that's how I got into reading, was through a wonderful, she was Welsh woman who went to university in Cardiff in the 1940s, which must have been really hard.
Yeah.
Full of rugger buggers, basically. And her. And I've got her books now. She won all these awards when she was a student. So it was really, a mentor, I suppose, it took me to it. So that's how I got into reading.
Great. That's it. Daniel, how about what's your story?
On my side, we had only one book at home, which was the Bible. That was it. My father did not read. My mother did not read. My grandfather, on the female side, he was very left-wing, against the Nazis, whatever, and he had Solzhenitsyn and a couple of other books in his bookshelf, but that was it. For me, it was basically I was living in a town called Leverkusen in Germany, which is kind of the German equivalent to Stoke-on-Trent. Okay, it would work very well. You would feel directly at home, I can tell you, Professor Rowley. So I wanted to get out of this, and so therefore I started in the public library and started on the left side on a shelf and read every book that was in that shelf. And after I was done, I was going to the next shelf and read all the books. Some of them were completely rubbish and others were fantastic, and that was how I started to learn. And I quickly realized that just having a religious book at home is not going to really help you in your life, different than probably most of the gentlemen and ladies here would feel, which as well is a cultural difference, right? I mean, when I talk about, for example, for buyers, about negotiation, and Stuart, you talked about this, how different negotiations are based on cultural settings, right? Mm-hmm. Western people have a problem with the way to negotiate because of their religion, because Jesus threw basically everything which was related to money laundering and so on out of the temple. So therefore, for us, my grandmother always told me, you don't talk about money, you have it, which we did not, but that was the story, because that was a cultural kind of setup. And with this, it is difficult, and you have to overcome that, and you have to train your cost muscle. If you come of other cultures, religion is in your speech. It's in what you talk on a day-to-day basis, which is normal because everyone around you is talking like this. Yeah, the name of the one above is basically quite important and needs to be done. Now, problem with that is you have a big issue with everyone who is not in the same culture because they feel alienated by that, totally alienated. Yeah, if people talk about this. So therefore, again, cultures and the differences. Yeah, in Germany or in France or in most of the under slowly diminishing Europe, as Trump believes, you don't talk about religion normally unless you're in certain circles. Yeah, in other areas of the world, you talk about it all the time. Now, this kind of cultural change has an understanding it and utilizing it to your advantage is, I think, something that really works well.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm conscious that we're running out of time. What I'd like to do is for those students that are on the call today, thank you very much for joining. What I'd like you to do is please send me your top three. I think it would be an interesting opportunity to maybe have this kind of discussion again, but perhaps having the students lead the discussions on the books that influence them. So if you would like, please don't hesitate to send in those books which have influenced you in terms of your leadership, in terms of your strategy. And I'd like to, first of all, wish everybody season's greeting. If you're in the West, season's greeting. And I'd also like to express my sincere gratitude for giving up their precious time today to Dr. Daniel Helmig and also Professor Chris Rowley. Thank you both, gentlemen, and thank you for your inspiring choices. Thanks, everyone.
Very much.
Thank
you very much.
Please share.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all the participants. I've had a great time, but particularly thank you for Stuart, even though he's over in the other place. He does belong here.
Thanks, everyone.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.